He's a recent graduate of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information, where he completed the Masters of Information program. He completed his thesis on the benefits of website structure tailoring for older adults under the supervision of Dr. Olivier Sincere. And Trevor's also a member of Dr. Chandra's Street Health at the Knowledge Media Design Institute. His research at the lab focuses on accessibility and accessible design in a variety of contexts, including higher education, data science, and mobile applications. And I have to say, I've had the pleasure of working with him remotely. This is the first time I've actually seen him face to face, or not even face to face, but online, because Trevor was instrumental in a whole series of videos that we created in addition to his supervisor, Dr. Olivier Sincere, Marc Chinal, who's a colleague of mine at U of T, and then a whole team of cyber seniors. We put together videos in English and in French, so I'm excited to see some of our French colleagues here on preventable causes or modifiable risk factors for dementia. And he did a great series for us on Toonly. So with no further ado, maybe I can ask everybody to mute with the exception of Trevor, and we'll give the floor to Trevor. Thank you, Trevor. It's all yours.
All right. I'll just share my presentation. And remove this.
Right.
All right. Can everybody...
Is it being recorded? I can see
it. Yeah, the recording should be going, I think.
Because usually it tells me something about do I want to record? Oh yeah, I see it on the top left. Okay, good.
Yeah, it's good. Okay. Okay. All right, everybody can hear me? Great. All right, yeah. So thanks everybody for being here. The name of my talk and also the name of my thesis is a tailored fit, design, and evaluation of a website structure self-tailoring option for older adults. And sort of just to give you an overview of sort of where I'm going today, to sort of put the end at the beginning, sort of the general points that came out of my research were that older adults' preferences for website structures can vary significantly, while specific structures, namely matrix and linear structures, and I'll explain all of those in a bit, are often preferred over hierarchical website designs. There is no one clear best website structure, and individual preferences can depend on a variety of things, including individual information needs and the specific tasks being performed. So with these individual preferences, I also sort of looked into how having the ability to change or self-tailor a website structure can improve older adults' experiences. So they're able to select the structure that they prefer, and also having the option gives them a greater sense of control when navigating through websites. So just to sort of back out of that a bit, this research generally takes place in the domain of information architecture, also called IA, which can be confusing with the other two-letter IAAI acronym. But information architecture is the structural design of shared information environments. And a bit more concretely, it's the synthesis of organization and labeling and search and navigation systems within digital, physical, and cross-channel ecosystems. So just sort of as an example of this, if you think about a website like walmart.com or .ca, all of this sort of organization of information, so all of these different categories, what's put in each of the categories, as well as the titles of the categories, as well as what sort of items would come up if you use the search bar, that all pertains to information architecture. So the decision to put something like I don't know, cheese shop under specialty shops, is that something people would expect? These are all the kinds of questions that get talked about in information architecture. And what my research pertains to specifically is website structures. So how different web pages are connected together and how people navigate between those pages. And there's generally 4 different information architecture structures that can be used when creating a website. So there's hierarchical, matrix, linear, and then the 4th one is organic, which kind of just means there is no structure. So I won't talk too much about that. But sort of this is one way of visually representing those. So hierarchical sort of has different sort of sub pages and subcategories. Linear websites will just sort of go one page after the other, and then a matrix one sort of has a more many-to-many option, so you can go to multiple different pages from each page. And so an example of that, again, if we're looking at the sort of the Walmart website, you see all of these categories. So that would be sort of representative of a hierarchical structure. You'd click into something like grocery and then get all of the grocery pages under there. However, most websites are pretty complicated and they aren't just one structure or the other. So if we're looking back at that one image that I showed before, this would be more representative of sort of a hierarchical matrix hybrid, where you can go to all of these different pages from this sort of main homepage. Another another version of a matrix style website that's maybe more familiar, or I guess more traditionally thought of as like a matrix or style structure, is Wikipedia. So having all of these different links and being able to go to all of these different websites from like the information architecture page, having all of these different links to go to is an example of a matrix website. And then linear websites are ones where you sort of go one page at a time. They often have this sort of previous and next button. Just as an example, this is the ethics application website for the University of Toronto. But lots of websites use these. Like if you're ever filling out a form for like a job application, or the like filling out like government forms, or often like online educational videos or like series will present things in a linear order where you just sort of click from one to the next. And so when looking into the research that existed for information architecture as it pertained to older adults specifically, there was a couple things that sort of stuck out to in the research more recently. And one is that linear websites were often thought to be better for older adults. Different studies showed that they were better than hierarchical or matrix structures. And there was a couple of reasons for this. Or a couple of reasons suggested for this. One is sort of the similarity to analog experiences or print media that linear websites often can provide, which makes them more familiar to older adults. So if you think about print media, for example, something like a book, you tend to navigate through it in a linear order, even if you're not consuming it, I guess, in a linear order. Like if you think about a phone book, you're still navigating through it in a linear order. Additionally, linear websites reduce the number of decisions that somebody has to make on each page when going between pages or something like that. You're really only deciding to go to the previous page or to the next page. And so there's an element of simplicity in that. And linear websites also allow for more natural stopping points, so it's easier to leave and come back and not lose your place. And so for these reasons, and also some evidence in existing research, linear websites and linear structures were thought to be better for older adults. However, some more recent research complicated this idea, again, indicating that there were some individual preferences that determined making either linear or matrix IA structures better for different people or different older adults in different scenarios, depending on their information needs or the specific tasks that they were trying to perform or trying to do on a website. And so sort of given this idea that, individual preferences can vary, I looked at other research which talked about this. And specifically in the context of providing information to older adults, there was the notion of information tailoring, which has been used in a variety of contexts. So one is content tailoring. So this is where When you're providing a certain set of information, either the level of detail is adjusted, or sort of what information is being provided is changed or again adjusted depending on a specific audience or demographic information. There's also mode tailoring. So this is where you change the type of media being used to convey information. So for some people, they may prefer written information, some may prefer videos. And so giving them the option to switch between the two is a form of mode tailoring. And then there's the notion of self-tailoring, where you allow people to make these decisions themselves rather than maybe describing differences or different versions of content based on demographic information. You let the individuals sort of consuming the information or using a website change those aspects themselves. So changing the type of media being used, for example, is one that has been looked at before. And so then that brought me to the idea of whether or not self-tailoring could be used to adjust website structure. So giving the users the option to change the IA structure of a website. This has been suggested in previous literature, but had not been investigated before my thesis. And so then at this point, I was fairly certain what I wanted to look into, but one thing that was still in my mind is how I was going to make a website to look into this. And it felt pretty high stakes that I needed to make a website that was good and was usable. So I felt like to properly investigate this, it felt necessary to involve older adults in the design process. And I'll explain how I did that in a bit. But when I was first familiarizing myself with some of the literature and looking into this, one thing became sort of apparent was that studies which involve older adults in the design process often didn't evaluate if they were effective or not, or if that sort of method of involvement was useful. It's sort of just taken like as a normative argument that it is beneficial. And so as part of my research, I wanted to include somewhat of a reflective element, or a part that considered whether or not, having like a group of older adults take their time to work with me and improve a design, whether or not that had a positive impact on the design that I ultimately came up with. And so from this, my research had two main research questions. The first focusing on whether or not the self-tailoring element was beneficial, whether or not using or having the option to self-tailor gives older adults a better viewing and navigating experience. And the second one was sort of understanding how involving older adults in the design process impacted the satisfaction and the perception of how that new sort of novel website element was designed and how it was used. And so my research took the following structure. So I came up with an initial prototype design. I then brought that to a focus group and we talked about it, and I got some feedback, and then I analyzed the conversations that we had, and then redesigned the prototype around that feedback to, address any concerns or incorporate any suggestions that I was given. And then I took that and conducted a usability evaluation to look into that self-tailoring element. And so I will walk everybody through all of that now. So in terms of the initial prototype design, so as May sort of indicated, I was involved with the development of a set of dementia awareness videos. And a lot of my sort of the inspiration for my research came from working on this project. And so I ended up designing the website around this set of content. This was done in collaboration with an organization called Cyber Seniors, who provides lots of educational programming for older adults. So the initial website looked like this. So there was a top navigation, and sort of the main element on the page was the video player with the video about one risk factor for dementia or another. Below that, there was some text information, sort of reiterating what was in the video. And then on the right-hand side is the navigation element. So that's where you can either navigate using what you see here is the sort of the matrix style of navigation, or you have the option clicking that button at the bottom to switch to a linear version. And so that's sort of the general sort of self-tailoring element on the website. And so I took this to a focus group. Oops. Focus group was 11 older adult participants. We talked for 90 minutes. I walked them through the website, asked them some questions, as well as allowed them to propose suggestions. So one of the sort of the useful things about a focus group is you're not just asking questions and getting answers, because people are having conversations or able to sort of think about potential solutions. So in addition to thinking about problems, I was able to sort of crowdsource some help to think about solutions, which was helpful for me as well. And so based on the conversations that we had, there was a couple areas of improvement that I identified, with sort of the most significant ones, or the ones that led to the most significant design changes, being adding some more structure to the matrix navigation element, as well as clarifying how the linear IA element worked and adjusting how the text content was presented. So then I redesigned the prototype that I had created based on that feedback and keeping those areas of improvement in mind. And so the first thing that I did was grouped all of the different videos or different topics into categories, because one thing they wanted was a bit more structure into how those were presented. And in fact, one of the participants even suggested that they got put into categories. So I thought I would follow their lead on that. And what that ended up looking like is, again, in order for it to still be a matrix structure, I sort of wanted to keep all of the topics visible, but just, sort of visually grouping them into categories, I thought would be useful in addressing that concern. And similarly with the linear IA element, to help it sort of be a bit more clear, one of the issues was, if you're just clicking forward and back, you don't really know, sort of where you're going, I guess, in the content. So one thing I did was show sort of the current topic that somebody was on, as well as sort of what would come next, and sort of all of the topics in a given category. And then the last sort of big change that was made was getting rid of that large block of text and replacing that with a set of drop-down elements, which the focus group participants thought would be useful for sort of condensing the amount of information that was being presented. So with this redesigned version of the website, I then did a usability evaluation. And basically what that means is I got a new group of older adults. So for this, I had 12. And I had them complete a series of tasks using the redesigned website. So they completed 3 tasks. The first task and the second task were using either a version of the website that only allowed linear navigation or only used matrix navigation. And then the third task they completed using the version of the website that allowed them to switch between the two. And so sort of the objective here with these 3 tasks was to first understand whether, like, on an individual level, they preferred the linear or the matrix version, and then see what it was like for them to interact with the website that allowed them to switch between the two. And so after the first 2 tasks, they completed a questionnaire, and that, in combination with sort of speaking to them after the entire usability evaluation, allowed me to determine what their preference was for. So based on how engaged they felt with the linear or matrix version, as well as sort of what they said when I asked what they preferred. And so just to show what that looked like. So for example, this is sort of the matrix only version. You only have the option to go between them using this matrix navigation. And similarly with the linear one, you can sort of only use that option. And then for the third task, they'd be given something like this, where you start with the linear one, but if you don't want to use that, you can switch to the matrix one. And so from all of that work that I did with the participants of the usability evaluation, I was able to get some data and some results to answer my research questions. So thinking about the first research question, which again focused on whether or not self-tailoring would be beneficial, the first thing to sort of understand is whether or not there was a clear preference from all of the participants, all of the older adults, for one structure or the other. And as it turned out, there was not a significant difference in the engagement scores, so in the questionnaire scores. And there's the statistics there for anybody interested in that. But basically what this meant is that there was not a clear or unified preference for one eye structure over the other. So from these results, I couldn't say that, well, when you're presenting content like this, the linear structure is the better option. It was sort of, some people preferred the linear structure and some people didn't. So that was sort of the first thing that was important for me to understand from these results, because it indicates that self-tailoring or having the option to switch between the two is beneficial, because there's not sort of enough people preferring one or the other to make that design decision easy. And in talking with the participants, their preferences for one structure over the other were influenced by a variety of things. So, for example, the desired amount of information. So if you're thinking about the two different versions of the website, and specifically the navigation elements, or I think I can just show it here. So if you think about the matrix one, there's a lot more information, right? There's a lot more, all of these topics. They're sort of all present at the same time, and you have to, select between them all, versus the linear version, you're sort of just going either to the previous video or to the next one. And, if you're typically going in order, you've already been to the previous one. So you're really just clicking to the next video. So some people found that the linear one offered less information and that was preferable, but some people also preferred the matrix one because it had more information. Their preferences were also influenced by how complexly they perceived their interaction. So basically what this means is a lot of it came down to like the number of steps required to get to a certain page or to perform a certain task. So I guess I can go back and show this too. So if you're on alcohol use and you want to go to medication use from this page, you'd have to click view next video twice, because you have to go to smoking prevention and then to medication use. So that requires like two actions, I guess you could say, two interactions. Whereas on the matrix prototype, if you're on alcohol use and you want to go to medication use, you're just clicking on that button and you're going there right away. And so for some people, this was more important, or this sort of greatly impacted whether or not they preferred the matrix or the linear version. Usually people who preferred the sort of simpler interaction preferred the matrix version, because you could just one click to get to any of the videos that you wanted. And there was also people influenced by their familiarity with the prototype that they were using, and also similar websites in general. So if one of the versions looked more similar to something they'd used in the past, maybe they preferred that for that reason, because of that familiarity. And people also mentioned that the type of task being performed influenced their preference for one or the other. So the kind of task they were given for all of the different tasks, or like the prompt they were given, was sort of exploratory, meaning they were, just sort of asked to look at what interested them the most. I wasn't asking them to maybe find a specific topic, or I wasn't asking them to prepare for some sort of like evaluation. Like they weren't looking for a specific piece of information. I was just asking them to explore like they would naturally, or as, if they just, I guess, stumbled upon this website. And so for some of them, I believe with this one, it was more inclined to make them prefer that matrix option, because they wanted to see all of the different topics available and be able to jump around sort of freely. But if they had a more focused task, like if they had to watch all of the videos, for example, maybe the linear option would have been better for them in that instance. And so the other main finding that's applicable for this first research question is whether or not the self-tailoring option was beneficial. So, okay, some of them prefer one version, some prefer the other, but are they able to, select their preferred version? And what I found is when I compared how they interacted with the website with how they, spoke with me afterwards and what they said regarding which version of the website they preferred, the majority, so 10 out of 12 participants, were able to use that self-tailoring option to select the version of the website that they preferred. And again, there's the statistics there for anybody interested. And so in addition to giving them or in addition to them like successfully using the self-tailoring element, there were two noted benefits of the self-tailoring option. One is for 8 of the participants, this gave them a greater sense of control over their experience. So being able to choose how they navigated between pages, not being forced to use something they didn't like, or something that didn't quite make sense to them was useful. And additionally, for a couple of the participants, while they did note, they were able to tell me like, yes, I prefer this structure or that one, they liked being able to use both. Again, switching back and forth. Maybe, they only want to look at all of the videos in a certain category. And then once they finish that, they want to, switch to a different category without leaving the same page, for example. So those were sort of two added benefits of the self-tailoring option. And then sort of just as like an extension of that, thinking about like my second research question, in sort of reflecting on and doing an analysis of whether or not that focus group and sort of the design changes made as a result of that were beneficial. So I identified 6 areas of improvement during the focus group, and based on the feedback from the participants in the usability evaluation, 5 of these were successfully addressed. So all of the ones here, apart from the visible information about the content, which seemed to be something that was partially addressed, but not completely. And also it did not pertain to sort of the navigation element itself. Visible information about the content, that was just sort of people had feedback about like additional information they wanted to know about the videos. So who made it, or what were some of the sources for it, things like that. I did add some of that in the redesign, but different people wanted different things. And so that's why I said it wasn't fully addressed. And so based on all of these results, there are some specific design implications that I came up with as, a designer and a design researcher. So the first one relates to accessibility and aging. And there's a couple quotes I have here from other researchers that I felt were impactful. One thing is, as people reach advanced old age, their individual personalities and identities can sometimes become hidden. The world only sees them as old. And one of the ways I felt like this was impactful, or this came up, is it felt like linearly structured websites were sort of recommended or used for older adults, sort of strictly looking at it from an accessibility perspective, which is something that I do a lot of research in, and in many ways is what led me to doing this work. But it doesn't quite capture the sort of the whole story. Older adults, as demonstrated to some extent by the work that I did, but also lots of other researchers talked about this, that older adults are not a homogeneous group, and they do have varying individual preferences when it comes to design. And so it's important to look beyond accessibility when thinking about older adults. There's a lot of different factors beyond just sort of maybe physical issues or cognitive issues that influence how they use technology, and how they use technology differently from different demographics, for example. But looking beyond accessibility, in my specific instance, complicates selecting one IE structure over the other. And one of the benefits of the work that I did is that self-tailoring can accommodate a wide range of needs and preferences. You don't have to prescribe a specific structure or a specific choice if you're thinking about, more broadly. You can design choices that users can make for themselves, which is interesting in some cases because this contrasts many other senior friendly sort of design, I guess, like paradigms, where often there are a lot more, often when there's a senior friendly version of something made, it's often like a simpler version, with a lot of choices or decisions to be made removed. But that's not necessarily always the sort of the best way to design for older adults. And I think a lot of them may even find sort of the lack of choice frustrating. And I think that's why a lot of them mentioned they like having that sense of control, being able to switch the different website structures, at least when I was speaking with them. And so when thinking about looking beyond accessibility, one thing that comes up in information architecture in particular is mental models. So these are sort of how we sort of mentally visualize information. And research has compared older and younger adults, and there's been discussions about how older adults create and process mental models differently from younger adults. And the reasons for this, or the factors that can influence this, are not necessarily related to just like cognitive abilities. So there's other influencing factors like life experiences, technology, biographies, societal expectations, changing family structures, and being in different stages of life. So older adults will have different personal contexts, social contexts, and technological contexts. And it's important to remember that sort of they're different contexts because they're different from the demographic of people who are being designed for. So like that's what makes it different. It's they're different because all of these websites that are being used are not considering older adults in the design process. They're designing for who they consider their primary users, which are often younger people, who just have different contexts, in which they started using technology, in which they use technology with other people. And sort of one way that this came up in my work was this sort of nuanced notion of complexity. I talked a little bit about it before, how even though the matrix option had more, I guess, buttons to click, there were some people found that to be the simpler version of the website. And I have one quote here from one of the participants who was sort of afraid or sort of hesitant when using the linear IA because it changed the page, and they were unsure how to go. They were more hesitant to use the version where like the page changed and they couldn't always go back to where they were before. And when talking with them about this, that sort of comes out of when they first started using computers and they used like like a function key driven computer in their work, where there was lots of instances of you would press a button or perform a certain action, and then you were taken away from where you were before and there was no way to get back. And now sort of digital application design has changed a lot, and a lot of those issues have been resolved. But that is sort of the context where lots of these people used or learned how to use these technologies. And they're still using a computer, and computers look largely the same as they did when they were first using them. So these sort of trepidations, or these like historical contexts, like influence how people are using these technologies. And so it goes way beyond sort of just differences in ability, whether that like cognitive or physical, or experience wise. It goes into how people learned how to use these different tools, and how that influences how they're still using them today. So then thinking about sort of some of the general design implications, this is sort of a slide that I always have because I talk with a lot of designers and they're like, how do I add this into or incorporate this or consider this in my work? And so for older adults, what I'd say is linear information architecture structures are not the best in all scenarios. Preferences can change based on the content being presented and a whole host of aspects about the users themselves. However, older adults are able to successfully select a structure based on their own preferences when they're given the choice. And this improves their experience, as well as gives them a greater sense of control over the task they're performing or the interactions that they're having. And then also user feedback and design changes benefited subsequent participants in this specific study. And so it sort of acts as a reminder or encouragement that user feedback and design changes should be tracked by designers and compared. And when I mean compared, I mean, different methods of user involvement, as well as the design changes should be compared with each other. And understanding these differences and sort of the benefits of different methods or different iterations of a design can help with future study designs and method selections, and sort of helps ensure that we're not wasting anybody's time. We're always being considerate of how we are taking time out of people's day to involve them in the design process. And yeah, so thank you everybody for listening to my talk. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has anything. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That was fascinating. Maybe stop sharing your screen and we can just go to gallery view and see if anybody has comments or questions related to Trevor's talk. And then maybe we can, after that, after we've answered those questions, have a sort of a more of a town hall sort of discussion about some of these issues that you've raised in their own practice. Okay, Lisa, first hand up, I see. Please join us.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Like, it was a really good presentation, and I really appreciated the fact that the slides were easy to follow. So thank you for that. Do you have any information on the background of the people that were in your focus group? Did you have any information on whether they were experiencing cognitive changes, or they had any kinds of disabilities, or any kind of information on how you selected them and what they were like?
Yeah, so obviously the sort of the topic of the content was sort of dementia awareness. We did not ask for anybody to confirm or deny if they had any form of cognitive decline, just for sort of health privacy reasons. But yeah, it was all sort of the general understanding that I got sort of from speaking with them, not necessarily from collecting demographic information, is because of the topic of the website that they were using. It's something that they all think about, or they all have people who, or they all know people who have dealt with some form of cognitive decline, or they'll be watching one of the videos and they'll make a comment about something that didn't work for somebody that they know, or sort of their anecdotal experiences.
Okay. And what sort of age range were the focus group members, and then the ones you identified for help afterwards? So
so the requirement for the study was sort of anybody above 65, just sort of because that's what so much research uses. I think the oldest person, so yeah, it was between probably 65 and I forget who the oldest person was. Probably, I think it was 83. So yeah, so somewhere in that range.
Okay, great. Now I'm just going to read out, Robin. So if you prefer not to say, just throw questions in and I'm happy to read those out. So Robin suggested, how would an average person know if they ever had a choice to change a website access? These people knew ahead what to do, but I wouldn't know just looking at any given website. Will there be a big flag on the top of each site where this can be done? So that's an interesting point, just to draw people's attention to the idea of having this hybrid model.
Yeah, so in the study, the participants didn't necessarily know sort of what I was investigating in the usability evaluation. So I didn't necessarily sort of point out that self-tailoring option, the button that changed between the two, unless there was a couple participants who maybe were asking questions about it. But the general idea was to sort of just let them find it on their own, and the majority of them did, I would say. But something that sort of isn't new in my study, but that exists or is talked about in a lot of guidelines, is sort of the like sort of contextual information and like tooltips. I don't know if I have a slide for it.
If there's something you wanted to add, we can add it afterwards if people wanted to look it up too, subsequently before we post it, perhaps, Trevor.
I just wanted to show, or maybe I can, here, I have an idea. I just wanted to show I can just show the website itself.
Okay.
And I think this will do it.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like one of the things that was useful, so I had some concerns around like these drop down menus, because you're in some ways you're hiding information, but these sort of like click to read and click to close sort of little like tooltips or like pop-up options were really, everybody really liked those, and they made this really clear for everybody. Like nobody had an issue using any of these at all. And so I suppose that could be something to consider. Like if I were to, I guess, make a third iteration of the website, is to add some sort of like little tooltip or pop-up element to this self-tailoring option on the side there.
Great. So we have questions first, Susan, and then John, and just maybe introduce yourself to where you're coming from. That'd be great.
Hi, so my name is Susan Murtha. I'm an associate professor in psychology at York University, and I'm really interested in the intersection between aging, technology, and sort of cognitive decline, like and motivation. So how do you get seniors or older adults to use things when maybe it would help them? That kind of thing. So I love this talk because I think it was really good to share kind of the findings that, maybe what they would like more of. I think, though, I would be curious to know, I mean, your sample size was really small and you're not quite sure about your group itself. And so I would actually be really curious to know, I mean, I imagine if you had seniors that had a tremor, for example, having a matrix may not be a good idea because they probably would have a difficult time putting the mouse on those small icons, for them to switch between topics and stuff like that. So I was just wondering what your next steps are going to be. Are you going to start to investigate sort of other types of groups within the older adult population?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely sort of an interesting point. One of the things that I was really, and this isn't, I guess, it's not really like a research outcome, but just something that was, I guess, very encouraging is, this, the website that I created was sort of based on a lot of like existing guidelines and research for making websites for older adults, as well as just like for anybody who knows like web design, there's like the web content accessibility guidelines, which are sort of just for accessible web design in general. And everybody used the website. Nobody had like a major like accessibility barrier, which was really good to see. But yeah, there are things that could be investigated in terms of, especially like depending on like the type of task being performed. I guess that I did sort of like mention that with like the number of clicks it takes to do something, right? Is there some amount of like fatigue with that? Or somebody with like you mentioned, like a tremor where they have an easier time using one style of navigation or the other. Generally though, like I think it's possible to make like a matrix style website, or one that has like lots of options, like accessible for somebody who needs like a larger target, like a larger like clicking target. And the guidelines that exist sort of support that as well. It's just that lots of websites think that looks bad, so they just decide not to do that, which is sort of a whole nother I guess can of worms in terms of like the visual design versus accessible design. But yeah, I think if I were to take this further, what'd be interesting to look at is sort of more varied like tasks, or if how it performs with different types of content. This was sort of educational, informative content. How does it work if it's something else? If they are like filling out a form, how is it different? I know another study that sort of didn't look at something like this, but did like a more traditional, like sort of just comparing the two structures, looked at like an email client and sort of a linearly structured email client versus, I guess, what we think of as like the Gmail or like the Outlook client now, where there's all of the buttons sort of available all at once. So I think it'd be interesting to see how it worked in different contexts like that, in addition to working with different people.
Could I just ask one more add-on question to that?
Sure.
So it's I had read that, for example, an older adult who's banking using an online banking system doesn't know when they've left the secure system. So if there's a link on the side or something like clickbait or something that pops up, they're attracted to that clickbait, and then they click on it, and then they're out of the system thinking they're still in the secure system, but they're not, and then bad things happen. So like, to me, this is also would be of interest to know, like, how would you still keep people so that they can get the information they need but are still safe and secure?
Yeah, that's the banking one's interesting, because I can, especially like in terms of like information architecture, because I can imagine sort of you're in your main banking window, and some of those links are to like the bank's like blog or like their news website, and sort of the goal of those links is to be enticing, right? To make people want to go and like read their blog, to make it seem like it's a an important article to read, to like stay informed. But now, right, you're out of like the main banking area, and then that website probably does have like advertising to help pay for it. I think one of the things there is, to what extent like should the banks be like segmenting those things? Like, do they need to all be on the same page? And also, yeah, it's sort of, that to me becomes like a more like classic question of, should it just more clearly be linking to like a news website or like the bank's blog? Because I think lots of people would understand that if it's, I don't know if they'd call it a blog, but whatever they're calling their like, I don't know, the opinion pieces on the bank's website. I think most people would understand if that was like phrased in such a way that it's, they're sort of leaving sort of their main banking area. And just generally there, I feel like the idea of having, sort of signifiers that are more clear would be useful. Or yeah, having a lot of times different websites will have like are you sure you want to leave option when you're like leaving a site or like leaving Facebook or something like that. And even though like this would be something happening like maybe internally, that's why that isn't happening. Like you're still on the same company, but sort of making it clear that it's like you're leaving where you do your banking, making that sort of clear, and maybe prompting a second decision could be useful.
So John's been waiting patiently. I just had 2 points. One, someone was asking about when it'd be available. We'll have it posted by Thursday at 5. I've connected the link if you want to see it again. There's compliments coming away about the trips being great. There was one quick question about how many hours per week did the participants typically spend on computer tasks? So in other words, how computer literate were the people that you were talking to?
I think the majority of them, because this was something that we asked them, the majority of them were using like a computer, like a proper like a laptop or like a desktop computer, at least every week, usually between like once a week to every day. I'd say was the majority of the participants. So, and that's, I guess, like another thing to consider, and it's something that some of the participants actually talked about. Another like change in context you could consider is using different devices. So thinking about looking at this content on a phone or on a tablet would be something else that you or something else that I or like somebody could look into, just because those contexts are different as well, and how people navigate there are also different.
Right. And so the other thing I was going to say is, Trevor, can you put the link to the website you were using so that people could look at that? Is that okay? You could put that in the chat?
Oh yeah, I can. Yeah, I don't know. I can't promise.
We would love you to look at it and share it. The idea is it's to be distributed. And then John gets the last question. Thanks for your patience, John.
Oh, no problem at all. No pressure. Thank you, Trevor, so much. That was really, really great. I just had a quick question about, I know when you were talking about the matrix versus linear designs, one of the things I also got caught in thinking like, oh, linear would be easier for an older adult, maybe somebody without experience, but it seems like maybe that's not the case. And I was wondering how much you thought maybe that was contingent on the initial thing that you mentioned about categorization and taxonomy, like because you're using something that's able to link to anywhere else. How important is that categorization in the beginning? Because I would imagine that would help a lot without any knowledge myself, people not getting confused, knowing where they're going, what they're looking for, finding information as quickly as possible, as directly as possible, without using a linear design.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely like plays a big role. That's one of the reasons why I think the initial design, here I can just pop it up again. But the sort of the initial design of just having, especially with the matrix one, just having these sort of like two columns, a lot of people didn't like that. They found that was like in its own way like quite overwhelming and like unclear. And people sort of suggested different ways of addressing this. I ultimately ended up going with putting it in categories. Some people thought putting it like in alphabetical order could be useful. But yeah, I think one of the things with like making decisions like this is it does depend so much on the content. Like, you know, if you think about like the Walmart page that I showed earlier, that's so much more content than I used in my study.
Right.
And so there'd be like a lot of different considerations there. And that's why like no website is really just one or the other, like in practice, because there's so many different things. But I guess like where sort of the design suggestions or recommendations like come into play is when you're looking at like a part of a website, right? You're looking at like this specific like area, like we were just talking about banking, for example. So when you're talking about, you're looking at your, you know, just your checking account sort of set of pages, not the whole banking website in general, you know?
Totally. Yeah, that's one of the things. Thank you. That's really useful. I work at the Center for Studies in Aging and Health at Providence Care in Kingston. And one of the things that we often struggle with just when we're thinking about design and stuff is, you know, a lot of the stuff that you find online or design kind of guides often have to do with selling products, whereas we're not selling any products. We don't have any of that. And really for us, we're like a resource where we, you know, if you're selling something, you may want somebody to spend a lot of time in one area, whereas we're kind of the opposite, where we would prefer somebody come in, find the information they need, and then move on to what they're needing to do. So it's, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no, so I want to thank Trevor so much. Now, there are a few comments. So some people might want to continue on, but I know that we're coming up to the hour of 2, so many people have to go. But Trevor, if you wouldn't, are you available to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes to answer some questions? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, no worries.
All right. So thank you everyone for coming. Great conversation. Great. And Trevor, that was really fantastic and opened up a lot of doors to me. And then we're hoping that you'll be attending our upcoming series. We have a variety of different ones coming up, but lovely to see so many people from across Ontario and Quebec and elsewhere. And Bob White, I'll reiterate some of your questions in case people are interested. So thank you, everyone. So Bob had a question about people wanting to print. And is there, like, I must say I'm more in the print version myself. So is there an option of printing some of the information? And is that something you thought about?
So that's not something that was like considered in like the work that I did. but definitely in terms of, I could see that being, there was one study I really liked that talked about sort of the different mode tailoring. So they also had a health information website where you could sort of like turn on, there were three things. There was a video, there was text, and then there was like a set of like infographics. And I feel like in that case, it'd be interesting, like to also add on, like if somebody could print and what that would look like, because so many times like printing websites is really bad. So yeah, it's not something that I considered. It's not something that even this other study considered, but it'd definitely be an interesting sort of addition to that, because yeah, so many people want information that they can sort of take away with them. So yeah, that would be interesting.
Okay, great. Anybody else have any other questions or comments or suggestions? All right. Well, no further questions. Thanks so much for participating. And thank you, Trevor. That was fabulous. And it's lovely to see our senior scholar emeriti on board. This is Leroy Stone, who's our emeriti at the Institute for Life Course and Aging, and delightful to see him. All right, so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again. All the best. There's lots of nice comments coming in about how great the helpful hints are, and many thanks for a good presentation. So great to see people. Take care. Bye-bye.